The double doors at the back of the showroom slammed open in the middle of the final chorus, and 4 uniformed officers walked in like they owned the room. But their eyes weren't on Dean. They were locked on the pianist. Wait, because what happened next wasn't an arrest, it was a revelation, and by the time those officers reached the stage, Dean would learn something about the man who had played beside him for 9 years that would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty. The Golden Mirror had been electric that night. The kind of Saturday crowd that reminded you why Las Vegas existed. Every booth packed, every table full, cigarette smoke hanging in the air like a slow-motion curtain, while Dean Martin did what he did best, made 400 strangers feel like they were all in on the same private joke. The band was tight, the drinks were flowing, and somewhere around the 3rd song, that magic thing happened where the room became a single living organism, breathing in time with the music. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? Because this story is about to take a turn that changes everything. Eddie Thornton had been at the piano since Dean's first Vegas residency, 9 years of shared stages, and late-night rehearsals and musical shorthand that only develops when 2 people have played together long enough to read each other's minds. He was quiet, Eddie, showed up early, left late, never complained. Dean trusted him the way you trust your own right hand, completely unconsciously. The song was building toward its final crescendo when the doors crashed open. Dean's first thought was drunk tourists. His second thought was that something was very wrong. The officers moved with purpose, spreading out along the back wall, uniforms crisp and faces hard. They weren't here to enjoy the show. Notice, the room didn't panic. Not yet. 400 people turned their heads, saw the uniforms, and assumed it was someone else's problem. That's how Vegas worked. You minded your own business. But Dean was watching the officers' eyes, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They were looking at Eddie. The music stumbled. Eddie's fingers faltered on the keys. A wrong note cutting through the arrangement like a crack in fine crystal. For one terrible second, everything hung suspended. The officers frozen mid-step, the audience holding their breath, Dean's voice trailing off into silence. Then Eddie did something that Dean would replay in his mind for years afterward, something that revealed more than any confession ever could. He ran, not toward the exits. The officers had those covered. He bolted sideways, knocking over the piano bench, scrambling toward the backstage door. The room erupted. Screams, the crash of overturned tables, as people scrambled out of the way. 2 officers gave chase, while the other 2 held their positions. Listen, what happened in the next 3 minutes would expose a secret that had been buried for almost a decade, a betrayal so deep and so personal that Dean would question every friendship he'd ever had. But before I can tell you about that, you need to understand who Eddie Thornton really was, and why 4 police officers had just interrupted the biggest show of the week to drag him off a Las Vegas stage. The backstage door slammed. Footsteps thundered through the corridor. Dean stood frozen at the microphone, his mind racing through 9 years of memories, searching for any sign he might have missed. The audience was chaos now. Some people pushing toward exits, others standing on chairs, everyone talking at once. Stop for a second and picture the geography of this moment. Dean at center stage, spotlight still blazing, the piano abandoned, bench overturned, sheet music scattered, 2 officers at the back doors, 2 more somewhere backstage, and 400 witnesses who had just watched a manhunt begin in the middle of a Dean Martin concert. The house lights came up, that harsh, unflattering brightness that strips away all the glamour and shows you the stained carpets and cigarette burns. Dean's manager appeared at the edge of the stage, his face the color of old newspaper, gesturing frantically for Dean to come off. But Dean didn't move. He couldn't. His feet were rooted to the spot, his mind stuck on a single impossible question. Who was Eddie Thornton? Remember, 9 years, 3,000, 285 days of working together. Dean had been to Eddie's apartment. He'd met Eddie's wife, Margaret. He'd stood beside him at his mother's funeral. 9 years of friendship, and apparently all of it had been a lie. The commotion backstage was getting louder. Shouts, the sound of something heavy falling. Then suddenly, silence. The kind of silence that only happens when something decisive has occurred. Dean found himself walking toward the backstage door, moving on autopilot, drawn by the need to know what had just happened to the man he thought he knew. Wait, here's where the story splits into two threads. While Dean was walking toward that backstage door, a conversation was taking place in the Golden Mirror's back office that would determine everyone's fate. The club's owner, Vincent Calabrese, was on the phone with someone whose name would never appear in any record. When the conversation ended, he made 3 more calls to a lawyer, a bail bondsman, and a person described only as an associate. The machinery of power was already moving, gears turning in darkness, preparing to protect certain interests and sacrifice certain others. Eddie's fate had been decided before the police even reached the backstage corridor. Dean pushed through the backstage door and found himself in a narrow corridor lit by bare bulbs, the glamour of the stage replaced by concrete walls and exposed pipes overhead. At the far end, he could see a cluster of figures, officers, stagehands, and in the center of it all, Eddie Thornton, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face a mask of something that might have been fear or might have been resignation. Their eyes met. For one endless moment, 9 years of friendship hung in the balance, waiting to be confirmed or destroyed. Then Eddie spoke, and everything changed. "I'm sorry, Dean, I didn't have a choice." Notice, those 7 words contained more information than any police report ever would. Not "I didn't do it," not "this is a mistake," but "I didn't have a choice." The confession of a man who had done something terrible and wanted the person he'd wronged to understand why. Dean walked closer. The officers tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But something in Dean's posture made them hesitate. This wasn't a threat. This was something else entirely. A reckoning, private and painful, happening in the most public way possible. "What did you do?" Dean's voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who had learned long ago to control his emotions in front of an audience. 9 years, Eddie. 9 years of sitting at that piano, and you never once thought to tell me what you were involved in. Eddie's laugh was bitter, broken. "Tell you what, that I've been feeding information to people who would destroy you if they knew I was talking. That every arrangement I played, every tour schedule I knew about, every conversation I overheard, all of it went straight to people who wanted to know exactly where you'd be and when." Listen. The words hit Dean like physical blows. Not just betrayal, but weaponized betrayal. Eddie hadn't just been lying. He'd been using their friendship as a tool, a cover, a way to get close to information that someone else wanted. Every shared meal, every late-night conversation, every moment of apparent friendship had been a performance, a long con that made Dean's own act look like amateur hour. The officers were getting impatient. One of them stepped forward, taking Eddie's arm, preparing to lead him away. But Dean wasn't finished. He needed to understand. He needed to know who had been pulling the strings, who had turned his trusted pianist into a spy. Who? One word, carrying the weight of 9 years of betrayal. Eddie hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the officers, toward the far end of the corridor, toward something or someone that Dean couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ask Calabrese. Ask him about Chicago. Ask him what really happened to Tommy Marino." Then the officers pulled him away, and Eddie Thornton disappeared around the corner, leaving Dean alone in that concrete corridor, with nothing but questions and the distant sound of 400 people demanding to know what had just happened to their Saturday night. Hold this moment in your mind, because when we come back to it, you won't see it the same way. The name Tommy Marino had just cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for 12 years, and what was waiting on the other side would put everything Dean thought he knew about his own career into question. But first, he had to deal with the audience. 400 people who had paid good money to see Dean Martin sing, and who had instead witnessed a police raid and a manhunt and the arrest of a man they'd watched perform countless times. The show had to go on. That was the rule, the unbreakable commandment of live entertainment. But how do you sing love songs when your world has just collapsed around you? Dean walked back through the backstage door and stepped into the light. The audience fell silent, every eye fixed on him, waiting to see what he would do. He could feel their expectation like a physical pressure, the weight of 400 people's attention pressing down on him. The band was scattered, confused, instruments abandoned. The piano sat empty, a silent accusation at the edge of the stage. Remember, Dean Martin had built his career on unflappability. Nothing fazed him. Nothing broke his cool. He could walk into any room, any situation, and make it look easy. But standing on that stage, staring at Eddie's empty piano bench, he felt something he hadn't felt since his first amateur night 30 years earlier. Genuine, paralyzing fear. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He laughed. Not his stage laugh. Not the polished chuckle he used for cameras and interviews. A real laugh, raw and slightly unhinged. The kind of sound that comes out when you realize the universe has played a joke on you and you might as well appreciate the punchwork. "Well," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I guess Eddie had somewhere else to be." Wait. The audience didn't know how to react. A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd, people looking at each other for permission to find this funny. Dean let the moment stretch, feeling the tension in the room, then made a decision that would define how this night would be remembered. He walked over to the piano, sat down on the overturned bench, positioning it upright with one smooth motion, placed his fingers on the keys, not as well as Eddie, never as well as Eddie, but well enough, and he started to play. The song he chose was slow, melancholy, a tune about loss and memory that he hadn't performed in years. His voice was rougher than usual, the piano accompaniment clumsy compared to Eddie's effortless virtuosity. But there was something in that imperfection, something raw and honest, that made the audience lean forward in their seats. Notice, what was happening in that room was more than just a performance. It was a transformation. Dean was taking the ugliest moment of his professional life and turning it into something beautiful, something true. The 400 strangers who had come to see a polished Vegas show were instead witnessing something far more rare, a genuine human being, stripped of his defenses, choosing to face his pain in public rather than hide from it. By the time the song ended, the room was completely still. Then someone started clapping. One person, then another, then the whole room. A wave of applause that built and built until it felt like the walls might shake apart. Dean sat at the piano, head bowed, letting the sound wash over him. For just a moment, the questions about Eddie and Calabrese and Tommy Marino faded into the background, replaced by something simpler and more immediate, the connection between a performer and his audience, unbroken despite everything. But the night wasn't over. Not even close. After the show, after the encores, and the standing ovation, and the endless handshakes with people who wanted to tell him they'd never forget what they'd witnessed, Dean went looking for answers. Vincent Calabrese was still in his office, surrounded by lawyers and associates, the air thick with cigar smoke and urgent whispered conversations. When Dean walked in, the room went silent. Listen, there are moments in life when you can feel the balance of power shifting, when you can see exactly where you stand in relation to everyone else in the room. Dean had walked into that office as an entertainer, an employee, A man whose value was measured in ticket sales and bar receipts. But something had changed in the past 2 hours. The way Calabrese looked at him, the way the lawyers fell silent, the way even the hard-eyed associates seemed suddenly uncertain. All of it told Dean that he had leverage now. He just wasn't sure what it was. "Who's Tommy Marino?" Dean asked. No preamble, no small talk, just the question that had been burning in his mind since Eddie spoke those words in the corridor. Calabrese's face didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The lawyers exchanged glances. One of them started to speak, but Calabrese raised a hand, silencing him. "Where did you hear that name, Eddie?" "Right before your friends in uniform dragged him away." The silence stretched. Dean could hear the distant sounds of the club shutting down, glasses clinking, chairs being stacked, the low murmur of staff heading home. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, completely at odds with the tension crackling through the office. Remember, every question you ask reveals something about what you already know. By asking about Tommy Marino, Dean had shown his hand. He'd revealed that Eddie had talked, that information had leaked, that the careful wall of silence around whatever had happened in Chicago 12 years ago was starting to crack. Calabrese seemed to come to a decision. He nodded at the lawyers, at the associates, and one by one they filed out of the office until only Dean and the club owner remained. The door clicked shut, the air conditioning hummed, and Vincent Calabrese told Dean a story that would change everything. "Tommy Marino was my cousin. 12 years ago, he was running a club in Chicago. Legitimate, mostly, cleaner than anything else in the neighborhood. He made the mistake of turning down the wrong people when they came asking for partnership. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Car accident officially. The kind of accident where the brakes fail, and the car goes off a bridge, and the body is never recovered." Wait. Dean was starting to see the shape of something, the outline of a story that connected Eddie and Calabrese and a dead man in Chicago. But he still didn't understand what any of it had to do with him. "Eddie came to me 6 months after Tommy died," Calabrese continued. "He was young, scared, talented. He said he had information, names, dates, details about what really happened to my cousin. He said he'd been there, that he'd seen things, that he could help me find the people responsible. All he wanted in return was protection, a job where no one would think to look for him, a chance to disappear into a normal life. And you gave him to me." Dean's voice was flat. "You put a witness in my band, a man with enemies, a walking target, and you never thought to mention it." Calabrese's smile was cold. "I gave you the best pianist in Nevada. What he was running from was none of your business." Notice, the calculation behind this arrangement was becoming clear. Eddie hadn't been just a spy. He'd been an asset, a bargaining chip, a way for Calabrese to keep tabs on valuable information while appearing to do a favor. Dean's band had been used as a hiding place, his reputation as a shield, his ignorance as a tool. But something had changed. Someone had found Eddie. The police raid wasn't random justice. It was a surgical strike, aimed at extracting a witness before he could testify about something. The question was, testify about what, and for whom? Dean stood up. His mind was racing now, connecting dots, seeing patterns he'd missed for 9 years. Eddie's nervousness before certain shows, his insistence on knowing the tour schedule weeks in advance, the way he'd always seemed to be listening, even when he appeared completely focused on the music. "The people who killed Tommy," Dean said slowly. "They found out Eddie was still alive. They found out he was talking, and they sent the police to grab him before he could say anything else." Calabrese's expression was unreadable. "You're smarter than you look, Martin. What happens to him now? That depends on what he tells them, and what he doesn't tell them. Listen." Dean understood the threat implicit in those words. Eddie knew things about Calabrese too, things that could bring down the golden mirror, and everyone connected to it. If Eddie talked too much, if he gave the wrong names to the wrong people, there would be consequences. and some of those consequences might extend to the people Eddie had worked with, including the headliner who had trusted him for 9 years. Dean walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. He turned back to face Calabrese, and something in his expression made the club owner sit up straighter. "Here's what's going to happen," Dean said. "You're going to make sure Eddie gets a good lawyer. Not one of your lawyers, not someone on your payroll, but someone who's actually going to fight for him. You're going to make sure his wife Margaret is taken care of, regardless of how this turns out. And you're going to tell me right now tonight every single thing you should have told me 9 years ago. And if I don't?" Dean smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Then I walk out of here and call every newspaper in Nevada. I tell them exactly what happened tonight, exactly what Eddie said in that corridor, and exactly what you just told me about Tommy Marino. By tomorrow morning you won't be able to book a birthday clown in this town, let alone a headline act." Hold this moment, because this is where Dean Martin stopped being just an entertainer and became something else entirely. He had no power, no leverage, no legal standing whatsoever. He was just a singer making threats in a back office at 2 in the morning. But he had something Calabrese didn't: the ability to walk away, the freedom to burn everything down and rebuild somewhere else. And in that moment, that freedom was worth more than all the money in Vegas. Calabrese studied him for a long moment. Then he reached for a bottle of bourbon and poured 2 glasses. "Sit down, Dean. This is going to take a while." The story that emerged over the next 3 hours would fill in gaps that Dean hadn't even known existed. The web of connections between Chicago and Las Vegas, between legitimate businesses and shadow operations, between the bright lights of the Strip and the darkness that made those lights possible. Names he recognized from newspaper headlines, names he'd never heard before, and woven through all of it, the thread of Tommy Marino's murder and Eddie Thornton's decade-long flight from the people who'd committed it. Remember, by the time the sun came up, Dean knew more about the machinery of power in Las Vegas than he'd learned in 20 years of performing there. He knew which officials were bought and which ones were clean. He knew which clubs were fronts and which were legitimate. He knew the names of the men who had killed Tommy Marino, and he knew why Eddie had spent 9 years hiding in plain sight, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to bring them down. But the most important thing he learned was this: Eddie hadn't been spying on Dean. He'd been protecting him. Wait. The revelation hit Dean like a physical blow. All those years of passing information, all those overheard conversations and memorized schedules, Eddie hadn't been selling Dean out. He'd been building a wall around him, feeding just enough information to the right people to keep Dean safe from the wrong ones. Every tour that went smoothly, every threat that never materialized, every close call that somehow worked out, Eddie had been engineering all of it, using his position as a spy to protect the one person who'd given him a chance at a normal life. The betrayal Dean had felt, the rage, the sense of violation, began to shift into something more complicated. Eddie had lied to him. Yes. Eddie had used him. Yes. But Eddie had also risked everything to keep him safe, and now Eddie was going to prison for it. 3 weeks later, Dean testified at Eddie's preliminary hearing, not as a character witness, though he did that too, but as someone with information about the circumstances that had led to Eddie's decade of hiding. The testimony was carefully worded, revealing enough to establish context without exposing the larger web of corruption that Calabrese had described. It was a tightrope walk, every word chosen to help Eddie without destroying anyone else. Notice, the outcome wasn't perfect. Eddie served 18 months for obstruction of justice, a plea deal that kept him out of the crosshairs of more serious charges. Margaret visited every week. Dean sent money, anonymously, to cover the mortgage and the bills and the small expenses that pile up when a family loses its primary earner. When Eddie got out, he didn't go back to the piano. Too many memories, he said. Too many stages that reminded him of everything he'd lost. He took a job teaching music at a community college in Arizona, far from Las Vegas and Chicago, and all the cities where his past might catch up with him. Dean visited once, about 6 months after Eddie's release. They sat on Eddie's small porch, drinking beer, and watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Neither of them talked about the Golden Mirror or Calabrese or Tommy Marino. They talked about music, about the old days, about the songs they used to play when everything was simpler. Listen, some friendships survive betrayal, some don't. What Dean and Eddie had after that night was something new, something neither of them had words for. Not trust, exactly, that had been broken beyond repair, but understanding, maybe, recognition, the acknowledgement that they had both been caught in something larger than themselves, and they had both done what they had to do to survive. If you want to know what happened the night the men from Chicago finally caught up with Dean, the night everything that Calabrese warned him about came true, tell me in the comments. Some stories don't have clean endings, just long pauses. The Golden Mirror closed in 1971. Torn down to make way for a parking structure. Vincent Calabrese died in 1973, heart attack, surrounded by lawyers to the end. Eddie Thornton lived until 1994, long enough to see his students win state championships, long enough to watch his own daughter graduate from law school, long enough to finally feel safe. And Dean? He kept singing, kept walking onto stages, kept making people laugh, kept turning Saturday nights into something truly worth remembering. He never talked about what happened at the Golden Mirror, never mentioned Eddie's name in any interviews, never included that night in the stories he told about his Vegas years. But the 400 people who were there that night, the ones who watched a police raid turn into a piano solo, who saw Dean Martin break and rebuild himself, they remembered, they told their children, they passed the story down. One man, one song, one choice to keep playing when everything fell apart. That's the story of Dean Martin and the pianist who betrayed him. That's what happens when loyalty and survival collide, when the people you trust turn out to be fighting battles you never knew existed. Remember the Golden Mirror nightclub. Remember Eddie Thornton. Remember the night the music almost stopped. And ask yourself honestly, if you learned that everyone you trusted had been lying to protect you, would you thank them or hate them? Some questions don't have easy answers. Some nights don't have endings. This is one of them.